Hello, US1, and good morning. Joke of the day. A brain and a set of jumper cables walk into a bar. They order a pitcher of beer. The bartender, though, refuses to serve them and asks them to leave. When the brain asks why, the bartender says, "Well, you're clearly out of your head, and I think your friend's going to try to start something." There it is. All right. So for today, got the end of the Civil War for you guys. Um, so we'll finish that. And also, remember, you've got a quiz on this material on Wednesday. Again, 10 multiple choice questions. It'll be on Skyward for the last half hour, just like your last quiz. Don't forget, set an alarm, do whatever you got to do. Also, your annotated bibliography, right, is due on Wednesday as well. So again, all this simply is the same document you gave me before with the bibliography on it, those three sources. And then after each source, a paragraph explaining to me how good of a source it is. Where did you find out in this? Why would someone want to use this source? That type of information. So hopefully you've been doing your research. You've been doing this. This doesn't seem like a big ask at this point. So that's what you got. So you got the rest of the notes in the Civil War, quiz on Wednesday, as well as your annotated bibliography. Okay. Hope all is well. Stay safe, stay smart, and talk to you guys later. So today we'll discuss the rest of the Civil War. So we just finished talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, which happens July 1, 2, and 3 of 1863. Simultaneously out west, we have the Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is the last Confederate holdout on the Mississippi River. So if you remember Operation Anaconda, step one, blockade. Step two, take the Mississippi River. Vicksburg is the only thing left on the Mississippi River that is in the control of the Confederacy. The Union commander at Vicksburg is Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is a general, unlike the generals back east. Grant is not afraid to fight. Grant takes heavy casualties, but Grant wins. Lincoln notices this. Lincoln, at one point, wanted to bring Grant back east to lead the Army of the Potomac before the Battle of Gettysburg. Actually, he wanted him even before that with the Battle of Antietam. Around the time of Antietam, he was told by Eastern generals who didn't like him that Grant was a drunk and that you couldn't trust him. And where this comes from is that Grant was a career military man. He had gone to West Point. He had fought in the Mexican War. After the Mexican War, during peacetime, well, he was placed in control of forts out in the West. With nothing going on, he did turn to alcoholism. He was an alcoholic, and he had relapses. And then to the point where he did get kicked out of the army in civilian life, he had failure after failure. By the time of the Civil War breaking out, he was basically broke. He was living off of his father in law's money. His father in law was finding work for him. So when the Civil War breaks out, he actually volunteers. And he says to the North, says, "I'm ready to come back into the military." They don't want him, and instead he has to work his way up as a volunteer, serving with Ohio's military. Um, Eventually, he works his way up all the way up to general. And again, this is a guy with nothing to lose. And because he's got nothing to lose, he takes chances. He's willing to fight. Before the Battle of Antietam, he fights a battle in Tennessee called the Battle of Shiloh. At the Battle of Shiloh, more Americans die at that battle than the American Revolution and the War of 1812 combined. It was a brutal series of fighting, but he wins. And again, Lincoln takes note. So it is Grant who is in charge of the Union at the Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is a fortress. Vicksburg is protected by the Mississippi River on one side, but it's then also up on these high cliffs, and it's also located at a bend in the Mississippi River. It is impenetrable. It is a strong Confederate position. Grant tries to attack it 4 different times, and 4 different times he is repelled to the point where he eventually orders a siege in which he surrounds Vicksburg and looks to starve these people out. Meanwhile, serving with him is William Tecumseh Sherman, who is his second in command. Sherman then starts fighting in the interior of Mississippi, attacking the farms of the people who were trapped in Vicksburg defending it. So, playing a little bit of psychological warfare on the people of Vicksburg. Of course, with a siege, the only way to defend yourself from a siege is if an army comes to your rescue from outside. There are no Confederate forces anywhere because Robert E. Lee has hoarded them all and taken them with him up to Pennsylvania for the Battle of Gettysburg. So, as Vicksburg awaits for more troops to come, they never do. Vicksburg holds out and then eventually is forced to surrender. And their surrender happens on July 4th, 1863. So, in the span of that week, you have Lee's army losing in Gettysburg, and now you have Vicksburg surrendering to the north, cutting the Confederacy in half. And continuing with Operation Anaconda, once you cut the South in half, you then further divide the South. And that will be a task left to William Tecumseh Sherman. Grant is promoted and is sent back east. So Grant will take over the Army of the Potomac. Um, and while he's fighting in Virginia, or organizing the fighting in Virginia, his second in command takes over Grant's army. And so William Tecumseh Sherman's job is basically to further divide the South. So starting in Chattanooga, Tennessee, he takes his army and he moves to Atlanta, from Atlanta to Savannah, from Savannah to Columbia, from Columbia to Raleigh, marching his army in a straight line, destroying anything in its path. He gives his troops orders to make Georgia howl. Traveling with his army and fighting alongside his army are former slaves that have now been enlisted into the Union Army, further um, causing more embarrassment and anger for the South. So not only can they not stop Sherman, but they are being beaten by former slaves. Sherman gets to Atlanta at a timely in timely fashion, and he takes Atlanta on September 2nd. Taking it so close to the election ensures that Lincoln will get reelected. Lincoln was running against George McClellan, and the thought was that if McClellan won, he would have sued to end the Civil War, basically giving the South its independence. So by Lincoln winning reelection, it basically ensues that the Civil War will continue on and Northerners are willing to vote for Lincoln because it now looks like the North is going to win. Atlanta was the largest city in the South. Atlanta was an industrial center. They didn't have many factories, but the factories they did have were in Atlanta. It's also a transportation hub. By taking Atlanta, you basically destroy what resources the South can produce on their own. What further makes this move so important in the Civil War is that Sherman's forces march in a straight line, and what they conduct is something that he called total war. Now, it's not really total war, it's more of a war of terror because he terrorizes his opponents. He's marching in a straight line, he's marching slowly, he destroys everything in his path. You know he's coming, there's nothing you can do to stop him. It is embarrassing, and it shows Southerners, the civilians, because he's taking the war to them. He's destroying private property as he moves. He's burning everything in his path. And it shows Southerners that their government is too weak to protect them. Furthermore, he's doing this behind Robert E. Lee. And so Robert E. Lee's soldiers come from all throughout the South. And so they're getting frantic letters from their families about this guy Sherman and what this guy Sherman is doing. And the morale of these soldiers with Robert E. Lee begins to disappear. And so it is Southerners who believe that it is Sherman who should get credit for winning the Civil War because it is Sherman who basically takes away the South's will to fight by fighting a nasty war of terror, by destroying private property, taking the war to the South. He destroyed anything. If it had any monetary value, it was either confiscated or destroyed. He would approach a farm, they would take the livestock, they would destroy what they couldn't take. They'd burn the house, they would take everything. They would leave the inhabitants only with the clothes on their backs. It was humiliating to the South that he would do this. Uh, Now, while he is doing that, Grant is fighting against Lee. So Grant takes over the Army of the Potomac. His strategy is to get between Lee and Richmond. Um, and every time he moves, Lee counters that move. Um, Lee knows he's outnumbered, and so he has to move quickly. And every time he moves quickly, he anticipates Grant's moves and he meets Grant with firmly entrenched troops. And so they fight a series of battles: the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, 4 straight weeks of fighting. And as you see on this map, Grant represents the blue line, Lee represents the gray line, and basically every time Grant moves, Lee moves, meets him, they fight a battle. So you see the Wilderness, then Spotsylvania, right, then North Anna, then Cold Harbor, right, then the Petersburg campaign. All of this in an effort to get around Lee and get towards Richmond, right? That is the plan. And while this is happening in Virginia, Sherman is marching on Lee's rear, coming up from the south. And so Lee's soldiers, while being beaten, are good soldiers. Grant's reinforcements are whoever they can find. At one point at the Battle of Cold Harbor, Grant's reinforces are the military band. These are men who've been in the military, but they've had no military experience. So Grant is willing to fight. And Grant will fight a battle, and if Grant loses like 100 guys, that's fine. He can get 100 guys back. If it takes 100 of Grant's guys to kill just 10 of Lee's guys, again, that's okay, because Grant's like, I can get 100 more guys. Lee can't replace those 10. So Grant is willing to take massive casualties. This is a general unlike any that Robert E. Lee has fought before. This is a guy who wants to fight, looks to fight, is not afraid of taking casualties. And when Sherman arrives, Lee now finds himself basically stuck between two different armies. And so as a result, he has to abandon Richmond. He heads west to a place called Appomattox Courthouse. And at Appomattox Courthouse, he lines his troops up and surrenders his forces to Ulysses S. Grant. The conditions for the surrender are actually quite honorable for Robert E. Lee. Before this, Grant and Lincoln had met in Richmond, and at Richmond, Grant told Lincoln, I think the old man is ready to surrender. At that point, Lincoln says, let's give him an offer he can't refuse, meaning that make an offer so sweet that he'd be a fool not to take it. And so as you see, the terms of the surrender are quite generous. Lee readily accepts these terms, and in accepting these terms, the Civil War, the fighting for the Civil War, basically comes to an end. Lee was the main army of Northern Virginia. Once Lee's army surrenders, there are other armies out there, but those other armies follow Lee's lead, and once he surrenders, they surrender too, usually getting the same terms. Jefferson Davis flees. Jefferson Davis eventually will be captured several weeks later, and he will be tried for treason. But with Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, for the most part, that ends the Civil War.